Well, good afternoon, Brighton. Glad to see you're here. How's things back east there, bud? Pretty good?
Yep. Yep.
Gone on holidays with your parents, fishing and all that stuff? Or camping? Or not
really.
yet? Not yet?
Yeah.
During your chess, have you played any interesting games that feature any interesting endings? You have to think back over that, I guess, eh? Okay. We're recording. Well, there's still a few minutes. One of the things I'd like you to do while we're here is think on this position, and what I want to talk about today are making little plans. So think on this position. You have white, it's white to play. Think on this position and what you might do. So you'll need to first take stock of what's going on, and then make some decisions about how you're going to proceed. That's one of the difficulties of having summer chess classes is everybody goes away. Okay, here we are. So have you any ideas on how you might proceed from this position? You can type them to me in the chat there if you like. Oh, we have somebody else who's shown up. 3 minutes to go. What we're doing, for those of you who's just arrived, is we have a position that comes to us from a game played between Ulf Anderson and Robert Hubner. And it was played in Johannesburg, 1981. And both of these grandmasters were quite good at calculation, as well as making general plans about how they would proceed and progress their game. Okay. So this is lesson 4, and it's called Step by Step, a Guide to Little Plans. It's rather rare when you're playing a game of chess that you can look at the position and say, okay, I know that this is how the game's going to go. And, oh, you can now see my screen. Okay, this is how the games are going to go. And lay out the game from beginning to end. That's not usually the case. Maybe in some rare exceptions, I suppose, in king and pawn endings, but usually not so. So the way you have to move forward is to create little plans. So a series of moves, maybe 3 or 4 moves, you attain your goal, and then you move on from your achievements there. Right? And so this lesson is going to focus on a guide to little plans. So the lesson aims here are to learn how to optimize the pieces in preparation for moving the position forward. And the other aim is to understand the concept of little plans and how they represent the practical nature of planning. So I'll read to you what Jonathan Hawkins has to say about this position. It was once suggested to me that in any given position, you should have a clear map in your mind of how the rest of the game will pan out. This is a nice thought, but this kind of chess is the exception rather than the rule. Often a player will have a general scheme in mind, but the specifics of progressing the position forward, but the specifics of progressing the position towards the goal are dealt with only in the short term. He goes on, almost always the master will progress in the game using a series of little plans. The reasons for this are clear. First, the opponent can take many different paths, so we constantly need to update our plans. Second, as we discussed in lesson 1, the goal of winning the game is usually too distant to visualize in any useful way. It is more useful for us to visualize ways to improve our position and damage our opponent's position. Through the repeated application of this, we can hope to build up a winning advantage. He goes on to say, let us see some examples of little planning at work. And so here we are in the position from Anderson versus Hubner. So it's white to play, and how should white proceed from here? Before we can do that, we need to take stock of the position from the point of view of material, piece placement, pawn structure, king safety, and threats. These are the big 5 that will guide our thinking. And then we should think about what it is we want to do. So if we look at this position here, we find that with it being white's turn to move, he can move his queen away. He can occupy the center possibly with e4. Um, he could exchange queens. He could move forward, I suppose, with his king, protect the queen there where it stands. Sorry, what else could he do? Somebody had a suggestion? So just think on this and see what we can decide or think about what we want to do. We find that materials even, grandmasters, unless they're attacking, don't usually like to be down material. We notice that white's castled and black's king is still in the center. We notice also that black is about to complete his development, I suppose, by castling. And then white would have to bring out the bishop in order to connect his rooks. We find that there are two semi-open files. The C file is half open for black. And, oh, sorry, the C file is half open for white, and the D file is half open for black. We should also notice that the pawn structure says that the bishop on C1 is a bad bishop because the pawn at D4 and B2, F2, G3, and H2 are on squares the same color as bishop. What other things can we notice here? Oh, the bishops are of the same color, so that might be something to consider. Okay. Nobody's posted anything in the comments. I guess you're still thinking about what it is you might want to do. Nicholas, have you any ideas on how you would like to proceed? This is Nicholas Ma. How would you think about White's way to move his position forward here? Okay, you don't have any ideas just yet. I'll come back to you. Jeffrey, how about you? Do you have any ideas about how we would move White's position forward?
Not really right now. I'm just trying to look.
Oh, okay, that's fine. Just have a gander. Cynthia, how about you? Have you any ideas about how you would move the position forward? All right. Here's what Mr. Hawkins has to say about this position. We joined the game after Black's 14th move. He's just played Queen C6. So what he's doing is he's offering an exchange of queens. And an exchange of queens will usually signal the endgame. However, it'll be some sort of endgame, or perhaps a complicated middle game without queens, because there's still quite a bit of firepower on the board. However, once the queens come off the board, the safety of the kings will improve, and we'll notice that actually the black king being on e8 as opposed to the white king being on g1 will be more centralized, although we still have to deal with the mobilization of the h8 rook. So we join the game after Black's 14th move, Queen c6. White is to play. Let us begin to consider White's moves and his plan. Number one, clearly allowing Queen f3 and ef3 is leaving ourselves with a weakness on d4 is not an option. So we don't want to wreck our pawn structure. Okay, with that in mind, we should either protect the queen or move the queen or exchange this queen. King g2 is possible, intending to meet queen takes f3 with king takes f3. And after 16 c5, Black is ridding himself of his weak c-pawn. The c-pawn here on c7 is backward on an open file. So if White is able to complete his development unhindered, then the backwardness of the pawn on c7 would cause a problem. So if we are passive, in that sense, putting the king on g2 to defend, then Black makes his desired exchange and plays c5, and after pawn takes pawn, has equal chances. And White would have only minimal pressure after dc5 and bishop c5. Instead, White plans the following. Here, he exchanges queens.
Check.
To misplace the black rook. Then he's going to play bishop g5. And this has three ideas, incidentally. The first, an obvious one, is to get rid of the bad bishop. What this is going to do is also to create a situation wherein we have a situation where there's bishop versus knight. Bishop takes knight, bishop takes bishop, and we have knight versus bishop. What that does is that gives White the ability to provide possibly an outpost for the knight on c5, also challenge the rook on c6, and perhaps cause some difficulties on the queen side. Notice here that the A and B pawns, being advanced as they are, expose the black queen side to a possible pawn attack involving a4. So we're exchanging queens, misplace the black rook, then play bishop g5, capture on f6, follow up with e2 to e3. So I want to take this guy, this, and then put the pawn on e3. Play rook at a to c1, and knight to e4, and f4. And we would have a position with a bishop on f6 and a knight on e4 versus a black bishop on f6 and a rook on h8. In this situation, the bishop would be the weaker piece because the black pawns would, or the white pawns on dark squares would inhibit the bishop's movement. So this is plan A. Let's see what happens here. Okay. So such a position with a knight on e4, bishop on f6, pair of rook exchanged, and a backward pawn on c7, that would be a desirable fantasy position. Of course, black is going to resist such a possibility. The ideas are to take on f6. Another idea is with the c1 square empty, black will not be able to ever play b5, b4, kicking the knight away, because the tremendous rook pressure would cause serious problems. So we have queen takes c6, rook takes c6, and bishop g5. And so black decides, I'm not going to do that. So he plays knight d5. Black chooses to eliminate all of the minor pieces and almost certainly one pair of rooks. As mentioned before, this makes his weaknesses more pronounced. So if you can exchange your opponent's active pieces and leave him with inactive pieces, then he's going to have problems creating counterplay. So what Hübner decides to do is he wants all the minor pieces off the board and to try and hold the rook ending. So knight takes, e takes, bishop takes, king takes, and rook at f to c1. So the upshot of this is that we're putting pressure on the c file. And after rook c1 and rook c1 and king d6, we find that black has managed to secure his queen side, so to speak. So step one has been achieved. We have a rook ending, and from black's point of view, he has managed to eliminate all of the minor pieces and a pair of rooks, and to some degree relieve the pressure on his position. So he'd like to play c5, but he'll need to play rook c8 to do that. And even if the rook does land on c8, he'll need to play c5 before anything happens. So he'll need to put his rook here, need to play c5, and even then he will find that he will not be able to take this pawn because of the pin on the c5. And even if he were able to play rook c8 and threaten to c5, to play c5, white could put his rook here or play to fix the c pawn and make it unable to advance the c5 square. Time for stage two. Now we have reached a new situation and we have to make a new plan. In situations like this with no obvious breakthrough, right? The only lever that seems to be workable is possibly a4 and possibly e4. And a4 and e4 will take some preparation. And even then, if they're played, it doesn't appear clear how we'll get in. So in situations like this with no obvious breakthrough, but no counterplay for the opponent, this is an important point. Black has at the moment, no way to distract white from playing on the queen side and playing against the c-pawn in some way. So in situations like this, with no obvious breakthrough but no counterplay for the opponent, it is okay to play without a concrete plan. So when your opponent has no counterplay and you're fencing about, looking for something to do, you don't need to have a clear plan of what to do, but what you must do is optimize the pieces. So white says, first things first, I'm going to try and mobilize my center. So he plays f3. Since black cannot move the c-pawn forward with any advantage or getting rid of this backward pawn, he just moves it to c6 and prepares to deal with white's mobilization of his center. So white centralizes his king. Black says, you know what, I don't want you to play e4 right away. With the king position improved and the structure, the shape of the pawns kept flexible, white must once again decide his plan of action for the next period of play. Three main ideas he can use. He can break through on the queen side with a4. So he can sacrifice a pawn in order to cripple the structure. However, doing such a thing would leave obviously the backward pawn on b2, give black a pawn advantage, but the structure that remains would be completely disfigured on the queen side. So a4 is an idea. He can mobilize his pieces in such a way so that he can play e4. So plan one might involve this. Plan two is to set up a situation where you can play e4 and possibly e5. What this would do is this would give you a 4 pawns to 3 majority. And you could play on the queen side and try and, or the king side and try and break in there. Another way to proceed is a general space gaining operation on the king side to cramp black's position. This may also make space for the white king to advance into a stronger situation. So just slowly move all of these guys forward and cramp the black king side. In addition to that, there is an idea to play b4 and to fix the weakness on c6 further. Which one or combination of these ideas would give us the best chances? And this is where it's important to have our calculation with a goal in mind, right? We say that, hey, the black queen side is compromised to some degree. So maybe we can put our king at d3 and play for e4. And maybe keep the tension right here and see what black is going to do. And if favorable opportunities present itself, maybe we could advance e5, f4, and f5. Notice here that black has no way to disturb us in our ambition. For example, we could play here. He plays a semi-active move here, trying to do something, and then we just put our king here. The rook has to retreat somewhere, and then we move our king to d3 and then play e4. This looks like a pretty good plan. Also, if the rook remains on the e-file, then it won't be able to easily, or if the rook moves inside the e-file, it might not be so easy for the rook to defend the queen side should white take an active plan over there. So remember, we're optimizing the pieces first. All right, now let's do some analysis. Breaking on the queen side with a4 would be successful if black were forced to react with b4. That would be desirable. However, black isn't forced to do that. And we would have the reason this would be advantageous for us is if we played a4 and black responded with b4, then placing the rook on c5 and shifting over to the queen side against the a pawn is going to cause some considerable problems. And the b pawn would be separated from the a and c6 pawns and would quite probably become a target for the white king. However, black isn't forced to play b4 after a4, and nor is he forced to play a takes or b takes a4, and he can just sit tight. So another plan is to place the king on d3. Breaking in the center with e4 and potentially pushing e5 appears desirable, but would require preparation by moving the king to d3. So we don't want to have our rook support this pawn advance. The rook is already doing good job on the c file. So we want to bring the king to d3 and then get ready to play a4 or e4. However, if we do this, black could advance with f5 and prevent our advance. So we can conclude that e4 is desirable, but difficult to achieve. How about the third option? Expanding on the king side will not win the game in itself, but gaining more space and maybe fixing another weakness in the black camp would be significant progress for white. The advance would involve g4, which would serve a dual function, as it would also dissuade black from playing f5. And if black isn't able to play f5, then we could more easily advance e4. What about fixing the weakness on c6? For the moment, playing b4 just seems black. Handy counterplay with a5. So playing b4 sort of sticks our thumb out, so to speak, for the hammer to hit it. And that hammer is a5 after some preparation with rook a8 and a5. And what that would do is black would get control of the a file and be able to create some counterplay. So we'll return to the game and we'll see that we'll make the least committal plan first. So with that in mind, g4, a5, and h4. So white's just preparing to squeeze black on the king side. Play where you're stronger, so to speak. He doesn't throw away the option of putting the king on d3, but he does give himself possibilities with his rook on the g file or the h file. So black says, you know, I want to be able to play f5 sometime in the future. And white here defends his base. So the rook does double duty. It is very active and works in conjunction with the pawn to prevent c5 for counterplay. And it serves a defensive duty to defend the e-pawn, preventing various attacks by the black rook on the pawn structure, on white's pawn structure. Notice the rook has no access to the d pawn with the rook, nor with the king, nor with c5, which means that the white king can take off and do whatever he wishes. So it's possible he might try this plan. And there doesn't seem for any way for black to stop this, because when he plays f6 to stop the king infiltration, then white might decide, okay, fine, that's done. I'll just zip back to go back in the line. And set about playing this. So another concept, another conceptual idea that you should realize is when your opponent doesn't have any counterplay, you can not hurry, so to speak. You don't have to hurry up to do something. You can play to induce some weaknesses in your opponent's position and then play against the new weaknesses. So after h4 and g6, we have rook c2, and black plays h6. So king g3. Oh, so I'm going to play for access to the f5 square. Notice that how the pressure against this pawn prevents the freedom of movement of the black king. So play to make your position solid in endgames. Don't make overly committal moves with your pawns. Admittedly, these two pawns are quite committal because you can't take the pawn moves back. But the idea is to gain space on the king side and hopefully create a new weakness. And so by advancing this king, playing f5, if g5 is played, then the black king finds a route, or the white king finds a route into black's position. So remember, from the previous lessons, the things that you are trying to do in the endgame are to win material or weaken your opponent's structure. And this is what white envisions here. So black decides after king g3 to slip up. He says, king f4 is too dangerous. I need to stop this. And so he plays g5. Whoops. He plays g5. It is quite understandable that black does not want to allow the white king to advance further. But waiting with rook e6 would have been a better strategy, right? Don't make those committal moves. g5 is pretty committal. And if you wait with rook e6, then king f4 can simply be met with rook f6,
Check.
driving the king back. However, he chooses g5. And after h5, we find that white has gained some space. Also, he has a lever, f4. When f4 does happen, it's going to change the structure considerably in the sense that the pawn will, after capture, be backward on the f file. It's true white's pawn on g4 would be backward. However, it's adequately defended by the king. But more importantly, after f4 and gf4, king f4, white's majority of 2 pawns to 1 would be able to create quickly a passed pawn. This is an easy decision to make, playing h5, as the h6 pawn could become a serious weakness if white manages later to successfully carry out a pawn break in the center, leading to the penetration of his rook. Incidentally, after g5, this would only be advantageous for black. He's able to quickly occupy the h file, and with it, the possibilities of counterplay that could occur there. So h5, so f6. King f2. So notice what he's done. White is, by threatening to break in, he's managed to get the h6 pawn fixed and has the possibility of playing later f4. So now he switches back to the plan of, see, this pawn here. That means I'll switch back to this plan and play e4. So king f2, king c7, and e3. Okay, remember, don't hurry. So we'll transit the king over here, and maybe we'll play for one of these two breaks, whichever seems more advantageous. King b6, king e2, rook c8. Okay, I'm going to play c5 and get some counterplay. Petrosian said that defense in and of itself can be a rewarding task and a necessary task. However, defending positions without counterplay is a joyless task. It's drudgery. So rook c5. Your opponent is seeking counterplay, wants his exchange of rooks? No. I want to improve the position of my pieces first. Rook e8. King d3. Rook e7. Now, notice with the rook on here, on c5, we have potential play along the fifth rank. This pawn might be pinned. So if we advance with e4, the rook will be able to see the g pawn, and there might be some useful things that are happening there. So e4. Rook d7. So black is not interested in helping white mobilize his pawns and opening the f file for white. This would make things very difficult. If d takes e4,
Check.
then white would need not look any further than his planned fe4, and after rook d7, rook f5, and he would have total domination. So if de, fe, and then rook d7, then would come rook f5 and rook d6, Black tries to defend as actively as possible. White would be totally dominant in this position here. Why is he totally dominant here? Well, he's got a strong center, active, remember, our definitions of activity, controlling squares in the opponent's camp and restraining the movement of your opponent's pieces. And he can play, after some preparation, for e5 and breakthrough. Maybe move his king here, play e5, and after pawn takes pawn, he has a passed pawn. His king is supporting this pawn, and he possibly will play rook f6 and threaten the h6 pawn. Also, with the pawn on e5, after such an arrangement of pieces, the king would be able to come to e4, then go to f5 and break in over there. So rook d7. So a3. So this is a prophylactic move. If white intends to go forward with his plan of playing for a breakthrough on the king side, he doesn't need black to be able to play c5 and mobilize his queen side. So he's going to play a3 and possibly b4. And after a3, it's time for a new plan. So simple plan is to play a4 or a3 and then b4. This secures the rook at c5. Then white will follow with ed, and after rook d5, he can play king e4. So I'll put the pawn here. This takes care of this rook. Then he'll take here. And you don't want to take the rook. And if black does take with the rook, then the king will come here. So rook d8. This is waiting, but it was essential to play a4 right now. So instead of going back here, the consequences of a3 are the placement of this pawn for temporarily is backward. And so this was an opportunity for black to fix the placement of the b pawn and ensure that white will have to play a different plan to break through on the queen side. But even if he is able to play this break now with b3, this pawn here on a3 will now be weak and will offer counterplay for the rook. So he had to play a4. And remember, what we're doing is we're attacking our opponent's structure or winning material. So here, a4 would prevent b4 and the pawns linking up with the rook, and would be an attack on black's structure. Or sorry, on white's structure. However, he failed to do that. Played rook back. And now the rook proceeds over to the king side. This seems strange, right? Black, both sides are repeating, but white maintains the tension so that he can go forward at his leisure. Rook c5, rook d8, and b4. Okay, so we have a situation where the rook is secure on c5. And with the creation of, or the movement of the pawn to b4 after AB and AB, we find that even though this situation can come about and the b pawn is weak, because of white's pressure on the center, black is not able to swing his rook quickly around in order to disrupt white from invading on the other side of the board. So after b4, a takes b4, a takes b4, the rook goes to d7, and we take on ed5, and rook d5, king e4. So now we see the action of this rook along this rank, and f4 is going to cause some problems now for the black position. So rook d8, can't exchange rooks, and now d5. And we break in, got rid of this pawn. The white king is considerably more active and has access to the backward pawn over here.
Check.
We'll give a check. King f5. And we saw that by playing on in the center, setting up the e-pawn break, and fixing black's weaknesses on the king side, on the queen side, white is able to infiltrate into black's position via the weakened f5 square. Hawkins says black can no longer put up any resistance. C takes d5, rook takes d5, rook e3. Okay, I finally get some counterplay, but it's too late. King f6.
Check.
And king g7. So we're going to exchange prisoners, but I'm going to have a passed h-pawn and an active king. So king takes, pawn is threatened, and so rook f4,
Check.
rook d6, and rook h6. And white will win. He'll come back and coordinate his pieces to advance the h-pawn. King and rook and passed pawn is going to be more than adequate to defeat the situation of rook and passed pawn. So piece by piece, white improved his position without ever looking too far ahead. Only when his small improvements had built up a large advantage did white think directly about winning the game. So this is why it's important to see examples like this and to play over grandmaster games and look at them critically. Because if you do, this will give you an arsenal of tools to use in your own games. And you'll say, oh, I've seen something like this before. And you can use this idea or ideas gathered here to help you play your own games. What I'm going to do is show you a concept that I got from a game played between Walter Brown and Anatoly Karpov. It's good to play over world champions games. This was Anatoly Karpov had white and Walter Brown had black. I think it was played in San Antonio back in the 80s. There used to be there's a company in the United States called Church's Chicken, and they used to put on a tournament in which they invited, you know, the leading players of the day and strong players from the United States. Whoops. Okay, maybe what I wanted to do was show you one of my games where I used this idea that I had seen a long time ago. So we'll get rid of that. It'll respond short. There we go. And okay, what we're going to do is we're going to go to my game profile. And we're going to see example of this idea in action. I remembered that structure is forever. And so recently in my games, I was playing for an attempt to destroy my opponent's structure. So we'll go over here to my games. And we will go to the Nimzo Larson attack. And you'll see what it is I'm trying to do. So I'll start at the beginning. Okay, this game isn't what I want. So we'll go back. So I started recently playing 1b3. First of all, it's easy to play these moves in Blitz. You fianchetto the bishop, and then as soon as your opponent gives you the opportunity, you take on f6. All right. Oh, so a pawn too far decided that he had to subject my game to computer analysis. I always like that when lads do that. Okay. Come on. Okay, here we go. We'll go back to the beginning. Now, this is what I had learned from Karpov. b3, d5, bishop here, knight f6. All right, since we know that structure is forever, I played with the following plan. So he captures towards the center. So here's what's happened. He's got a central pawn preponderance. He's got an open g file. But this h pawn is isolated, and provided white plays and remembers that he should put all of his remaining pawns, where possible, on squares the opposite color of the bishop that is remaining on the board, he'll have a harmonious position. So that's what Karpov taught me. Exchange, create an imbalance, in this case, bishop versus knight. But now you will put all your pawns on dark squares, and you will not make a liberating pawn exchange when your opponent offers it. So already, Black has said, you know what? I'm not going to be playing for c5. I'm going to be playing for e5. But you, as white, are not going to be playing pawn takes pawn. So bishop d3, you have been mentioned to you that if your opponent has the bishop pair, one of the things that you should do is play to neutralize his remaining bishop. So he says, no, I want you to undouble my pawns. I say, I'll undouble your pawns. All right, so structure is forever. So here's what has happened, right? He has kept his double pawns. I've got my set of double pawns. And I have advanced on the king side and left him with the remaining bishop versus my knight. So I have the knight pair, but I have to be careful about allowing him active pawn breaks. So e6, knight here, rook g8, king f1. So I decide to do this because I don't want to commit my pawn to g3 just yet. So he played f5 to possibly play f4, and now I play g3. So c6. So he is playing in the correct strategy. He's putting his pawns on squares, the opposite color of his bishop, and is creating a harmonious position here. So I drive his piece back, and I play to keep the knight out of play, and I play b5. So I do this in order to create a weakness on the c file. Okay, so both of us now are going to play on the queen side. Who is going to be the faster to get over there? Notice the usefulness of this pawn here, prevents his knight from coming at me. This knight is working in conjunction to protect the g pawn. So this prevents some sacrifices on the g3 square in order to mobilize the queen and the rook against my king. So now I start to infiltrate on the other side of the board. So he says, no, I can't really let you dominate over there with your rook.
check,
So what I'm saying here is you can win the h-pawn, but I will have a passed a-pawn and will have infiltrated with my queen and rook on the other side of the board.
check,
So win a pawn and put a rook on the 7th. He takes this pawn and I win this bishop.
check,
And the rest is a matter of technique. And I went on to win this game. But the important thing that you should see here is the creation of an imbalance. Bishop here takes on f6, crippling his pawn structure, and then placing the pawns on squares opposite the color of my remaining bishop. And I had learned this from playing over the game Anatoly Karpov versus Walter Brown. And it was, I think, knight f3, knight f6, b3, g6, bishop b2, and then d5, heading for a Grunfeld type structure. And then what seemed a revolutionary idea to me at the time, Karpov played bishop takes b2, takes f6. And I remembered that because I was going over some games, and I said, oh, here's an idea that I had seen before, and I'll try and apply it in my games, and it's been quite successful. All right, how soon before the tournament? Can anybody tell me? I think 3 minutes, is that right? Two minutes. Okay, so those of you who have not joined the tournament, head there now, check out the analysis position, and make some plans on how you will proceed from there. Thank you very much for all of you attending, and good luck to everybody in the tournament. And thank you for coming to this lesson here. And we'll continue with this theme, step by step, a guide to little plans, next week. Thank you very much. If you have any questions, post them in the chat, in the game, or in the tournament chat if you like, and I'll be observing from there.